Well, hello, everyone, wherever you may be. My name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the Asia Program Deputy Director and Senior Associate at the Wilson Center. Thanks for joining us today for this event, which will look at the implications of recent developments for the recent developments in Afghanistan for the South Asia region. It marks the latest product of the Wilson Center's new Afghanistan initiative, Hindsight Up Front. We have a great panel with us today, and I'll briefly introduce them. All of them have either been Wilson Center Fellows or partnered with us in some other way. Ambassador David Hale is a Wilson Center Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow. He was previously Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and before that, he was, among other things, the U.S. Ambassador to Pakistan and Lebanon, and the Special Envoy for Middle East Peace. Ambassador Maliha Lodi is a former Wilson Center Public Policy Fellow. She is a former Pakistan ambassador to the US, the UK, and the UN. She's also served as an editor with the News newspaper in Pakistan, and early in her career, she taught politics at the London School of Economics. Nandan Unnikrishnan is a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi, where he oversees the Eurasia program. He was previously a journalist with the Press Trust of India and also with Business India's TV channel, TVI. And he's also held a position at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses. Huma Yusuf is a Wilson Center Global Fellow and a former Pakistan scholar. She is a weekly columnist for Dawn, a Pakistani newspaper. She was previously features editor for Dawn and the monthly news analysis magazine Herald. And last but not least, we have Dr. Venkat Lokanathan. He is a Wilson Center Global Fellow and also director and associate professor at the School of International Cooperation, Security, and Strategic Languages at Rashtriya Raksha University in India. And he is a former assistant director of the National Security Council Secretariat in the Government of India. So it really is a great and varied panel. But first, before we get to it, I'd like to recognize the Wilson Center's President, Director, and CEO, Ambassador Mark Green, who's kindly agreed to offer some opening thoughts. So over to you, Ambassador Green.
Great. Thanks, Michael, and welcome everyone to this third in our series, Hindsight Up Front, Lessons and Implications of the Withdrawal from Afghanistan. Our first session featured our Global Advisory Council co-chairs, David Petraeus and Sir John Scarlett. Our second, National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster. You can still view those sessions by going to our website. You'll also find there a collection of Wilson Center materials that will provide context and deeper analysis on this challenging topic. And now for today, and a program that I believe will be every bit as informative and interesting, what the withdrawal means for South Asia. In 2020, Congress created a blue ribbon panel of experts called the Afghanistan Study Group. Its purpose was to create new recommendations on Afghanistan for policymakers. I was a member of that study group. Our final report, called A Pathway for Peace, concluded that the best American approach for Afghanistan required a new overarching regional strategy. The report stated that Afghanistan lies in the middle of a region beset with rivalries and low levels of trust. It saw the potential for a fragile but real regional consensus behind a stable and neutral Afghanistan that is neither a haven for terrorists nor a fiefdom of the Taliban. We found that a stable Afghanistan would create the potential for regional economic cooperation that could benefit all countries in the region. But we also warned that an unstable Afghanistan risks destabilizing the region to continue trade in illicit drugs, the attraction of extremist ideologies, and the possible exacerbation of the rivalry between India and Pakistan, two nuclear-armed powers. So the question is, which will it be? And what would an overarching regional strategy look like? Of course, as we gather, we're all facing more immediate questions. From refugee flows to the interruption of humanitarian and development assistance to the movement of violent extremists, what are the spillover effects of the Taliban takeover? What position will South Asian governments take towards the Taliban regime? And under what conditions will they recognize it? That's a lot to process and a lot that we need to get right. And the experts here today, as Michael introduced them, they can help us make a good start. I'm looking forward to the program. Michael, back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Green, for those very useful opening comments, which I think have teed up the discussion very nicely. And so we'll now have each of the panelists offer a brief opening comment before we go to questions. And if you in the audience have a question, please tweet it to @AsiaProgram, PROGRAM, or email it to asia@wilsoncenter.org. So let's get started. And I wanted to first recognize Ambassador Hale. So Ambassador Hale, over to you for your opening comment. Ambassador Hale, I think you're muted. Is he still with us? There he is.
Great. Sorry about that. I was just saying hello to everyone. Michael, Mark, thank you. Let me start with a disclaimer. I'm a Foreign Service officer still today. I'm on secondment or on a fellowship at Wilson and enjoying that very much. I, of course, speak for myself and not the State Department. By the same token, though, as an FSO, I think it's important to do what I've always preached to others, which is any dissent, which is invaluable in the Foreign Service, be voiced within the system and not outside the system. So I will be focusing my comments on the future and on the implications more than on recent events, which I think is an invaluable opportunity now to talk about where we go from here. Once the evacuation done, which is obviously job one, we need to move very quickly, and in fact now, to beginning to think about the geostrategic considerations, to look at things with fresh eyes. We have no longer the heavy baggage that we bore, for better or ill, in Afghanistan, and to develop new concepts and plans to address the post-withdrawal environment. We still have vital counterterrorism interests at stake in the region, and we should do all we can under the new circumstances to prevent ISIS and al-Qaeda from again threatening the U.S. from Afghanistan. We also still have a strong global web of alliances that are strong and vibrant and relevant, and we should continue to bring them to bear on joint counterterrorism interests in South Asia. And we will need the capacity and to the extent possible, the will to target terrorist sites in Afghanistan and not do so alone, but to work jointly with these alliances that I mentioned. I'd like to comment first on Afghanistan. Our leverage remains real, if limited. The Taliban, in my opinion, do not crave international legitimacy so much that they will compromise on their core principles or change their true colors. Their statements, the ones we're hearing now, are to be expected, while their behavior, which we're seeing now, demonstrates that they have not really changed since 2001. And when they say governance will be guided by the Sharia, they mean it will be guided by their version of the Sharia, which will make Saudi Arabia look a lot like the city of San Francisco. We must apply pressure, even if chances of it altering behavior are limited. We can build a coalition that will take the measures we have already taken and more. I'm speaking of freezing assets, of stopping cash transfers, of withholding diplomatic recognition, of continuing the UN sanctions, while of course communicating to the Taliban how to ease these pressures, which would be on their part suppressing ISIS and al-Qaeda, protecting human rights and humanitarian access, and allowing the processing of refugees, among other goals. Achieving these goals will require dialogue with the Taliban. We talked to them while we fought. There's no reason we can't do so after our withdrawal if we see a potential for results. That is not the same thing as offering diplomatic recognition. I think there's a low probability of success in such a dialogue. The Taliban standards of successful governance differ from ours fundamentally, and probably from those standards of most Afghans, who are helpless, unfortunately, to disagree, but try we should. Let me turn to Pakistan briefly. Our relations with and the behavior of a nuclear state matter. But the US is no longer constrained by the need to preserve the so-called ALOCs and GLOCs, the air and ground logistical communication links that we required from Pakistan to sustain the war in Afghanistan. Those gave Pakistan leverage over us, and we no longer need to tolerate the things we tolerated because of that dependency, including years of duplicity in our diplomatic dialogue about the Taliban. Pakistan feels vindicated. We see that in the news coverage by the victory of the Taliban, We see them believing this eliminates the Indian inroads that were made in Afghanistan. We see that they believe they've gained new strategic depth, a long-term goal of the Pakistani military establishment. We see that it puts in place leaders that Pakistan has long sheltered and cultivated as the leaders in Kabul. I'm sure Pakistan sees the new regime as an opportunity for security and stability and economic growth, which would benefit Pakistan. But we all, I think, need to urge our friends to think again. There's a risk, of course, immediately of an emboldened TTP, the Pakistan Taliban, a group that the Pakistani military suppressed at great expense a few years ago, and of course of extremism generally reemerging. Pakistan is deeply complicit with the Taliban, yet knows that and learned, unfortunately, that it can't always get the cooperation they seek from the Taliban. This dilemma is now worse for them now. So our message should be clear and tough. There will be global pressure on the Taliban to prevent the emergence of terrorist groups threatening the world from Afghanistan. Pakistan is going in that pressure campaign or be isolated. They have to ask themselves whether they want to be tethered to a state that runs the risk of becoming another pariah state. And moreover, if Al-Qaeda or ISIS were to mount a campaign from Afghanistan that would harm U.S. interests, Islamabad should brace for the worst. Just spend a moment on India. We have a lot of expertise here on that, but my own view is not very much changes, actually. India will become, again, a potential target, as they are now, for extremism. But India's involvement in Afghanistan, to me, was more tactical than strategic. And I don't see a major change in the equation, given India's influence and demographic size and ability to extend power. Our own strategic relationship with India is an opportunity to weigh the consequences of what's just happened. But of course, it's not a substitute for the direct regional presence that we did benefit from in Afghanistan. Before I turn this back over to you, Michael, I'd like just one word on Central Asia. America's developed very strong ties there, and we see Moscow already reasserting its power post-U.S. withdrawal. And I think it's going to be important for the United States to continue to bear in mind Central Asia into the equation, consult the leaders there, expand our projects, deepen our CT cooperation. We're not competing with Russia and China, but we are offering alternatives. I think that's very important. And lastly, perhaps we'll have time to discuss China and how we should engage China at this important moment. But I'll leave that to the Q&A. Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Hale. And indeed, we'll be doing future programs looking at the impact of what's going on in Afghanistan, on China, and on Russia. But thank you for those additional comments. Let's now go to Ambassador Lodi. I think you're muted, Ambassador.
Myself?
Yes, there we go.
Okay,
we
now you can hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I wanted to first, of course, thank Michael, Ambassador Green. It's good to see Ambassador Hale as well. So it's a great pleasure to be virtually back at the Wilson Center. I have very fond memories of spending many, many months there. Let me try to give you a Pakistan perspective, which is why you've asked me. So this is a perspective very much from Islamabad. I'm no longer an official, but let me try to explain where Pakistan is right now. I have written a piece which appeared in the FT today, which really talked about Pakistan's fears about what might happen if the Taliban are unable to form a government by accommodating others, and if they fail to govern, and if they revert to the kind of behavior that was characteristic of them back in the 1990s. So I'm not going to repeat that, but I would ask you to just have a quick look, because quite different from what Ambassador Hale has said, actually, there may be some people here who may be sanguine about the future, but certainly I don't find serious people in my country, including those in both the civil and military circles, in any way being less apprehensive than the rest of the neighbors of Afghanistan about what might happen. The reason is simple. The situation is extremely uncertain. Certainly, there has been relief over the fact that there was no protracted bloodshed and that Afghanistan did not descend into a civil war, which many were forecasting. Let's face it, the intelligence agencies of just about every country didn't foresee what happened. Neither did we. Pakistan was just as stunned as the rest of the world in the speed and relatively bloodless way in which the Taliban took over. So the questions that we are confronted with are pretty much the same that the international community is going to be grappling with, which is, will they be able to govern? How different are the Taliban from when they ruled in the 1990s, when they imposed an austere and repressive system on the people? Pakistan is in no mood to rush to recognition. Diplomatic engagement continues. I think every country is engaging, just about every country. Shouldn't say every country, but most countries are engaging with the Taliban. But everyone is withholding recognition because, like everyone else, we in Pakistan also want to see whether the Taliban will make good on the promises that they have made. And I think the answers to these questions will only emerge with time. Pakistan has played an active behind-the-scenes role, also expected of it by the international community and also requested by the United States to nudge the Taliban towards an inclusive government. This is a work in progress, but I think we believe it's important in this phase to continue to engage with the Taliban, as engagement is likely to have a moderating effect, and it's already obliged them to hold out assurances. Now, of course, we don't think that we'll be content with just these assurances. We'd like to see them translated into actions. But certainly, Pakistan has leverage, but there are limits to Pakistan's leverage now that the Taliban are in control of their country. So collective action, in fact, may be more effective. And in our view, the extended troika, which comprises the United States, Russia, China, and Pakistan, remains a useful vehicle to exert joint pressure. I think we've already seen in the UN Security Council statement of 16th of August what the international community expects the Taliban to do. And these expectations are, obvious: respect for human rights, respect for women's rights, forming an inclusive government, running the country in a manner that is accommodative of other groups, and of course, above all, the need for the next or the new Afghan government to combat terrorism. As Ambassador Hale has said, for Pakistan, a huge challenge is the presence of the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban as it is called, which is about 6,000 strong and remains in Afghanistan. Now, we've heard also the Afghan Taliban say that they will deal with these groups. This is of concern to us, but as you all know, for the Chinese, it's ETIM. For the Central Asians, it's IMU. For the Russians and everyone else, actually, it's ISIS or Daesh. So these are of great concern. And for Pakistan's security, it's essential that we see the Taliban take action. Now, they've said that they will not allow their country to be used as a haven for these terrorist groups. But, it's important that we see, as I said before, it's important that we see them take action against these groups. As far as Pakistan is concerned, as I said, the stakes are very high, clearly, as it is for other countries. And this is very much a personal view. I think it's very important for the international community to remain united so that collective pressure can be mounted on the Taliban. I think if this international consensus, which is there right now, I think all countries now expect to see the same of the Taliban as anybody else. But if this international unity fractures and major differences emerge between, let's say, neighbors or the big powers, then it'll provide wriggle room to the Taliban to back out of their promises. And I don't think that is something that Pakistan will want to see or anybody else would want to see. So for now, I think I would end on this note that, there is great, it's a fraught situation. Nobody really can tell what will happen post August 31st. The Taliban have said, in fact, the Americans have requested the Taliban, as far as we know, that they should not form the government until after August the 31st. The Taliban have actually said this also publicly. Now, let's see if after that they're able to actually form a government. They claim that they have reached a deal with the Northern Alliance. Again, we don't know whether this will happen. But I can say this: Pakistan, other than Afghanistan itself, has the most to gain from peace and the most to fear if Afghanistan descends into another round of, if not civil war, but protracted fighting or instability. So there's certainly, I mean, I don't know if there are triumphal noises coming from certain sections in Pakistan. That certainly does not reflect the views of those who are in charge of the country's security. I think we're watching the situation very, very closely, very carefully. And Pakistan wants to be lockstep with the international community on these issues of recognition, also of dealing with the Taliban, ensuring that they stick to their promises, because Pakistan knows that it faced isolation in the 1990s when it was one of 3 countries that recognized the Taliban. So there is absolutely no desire for Pakistan to return in any way to that period. In any case, the international environment is fundamentally different from the 1990s. So we're consulting closely with the Chinese, with the Russians, of course, with the Americans as well. With Iran, as I speak, my country's foreign minister is on his way to meet with the new foreign minister of Iran, also visiting Central Asian Republic. So we're very interested in seeing what kind of a regional consensus can emerge. I mean, basic precepts and principles are there, but there's a need to operationalize them because, everybody can make these feel-good statements. But the important thing is countries, including mine, we have to abide by what we say. So let's see when the political fog begins to lift after August the 31st, because, it'll become clear whether Afghanistan's leaders will be able to deliver peace over time that their people are so desperate to see. Because if they're unable to do this, then not only Afghanistan that will be at risk, it will also be Pakistan and the rest of the region. So the last thing, we want to see is a situation of that kind. And if you like a reversion, although I think it's too early to talk about such things, but, it's important to flag them. The kind of proxy war that we saw in the 1990s, I mean, this is not something that anybody in Pakistan would either wish to engage in or would want to see. So let me end on that note. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Lodi. And I agree with your point that, we'll have hopefully a better sense as to how things will look in Afghanistan after August 31st. Of course, that's especially the case if the administration does indeed pull all its troops on the 31st, which it plans to do now, but one never knows if things will change in the coming days. At any rate, let's now go to Nandan Unnikrishnan. Over to you, Nandan.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you to the Wilson Center. I think between Ambassador Hale and Ambassador Lodi, they have covered most of the ground. So I may sound a bit repetitive, but given the paucity of time, I also may oversimplify some things, but I'm sure we can deal with that in question time, as it were. So I'll try and reduce this to basically looking a little ahead and looking at 2 options. One is the option of stability. There are many questions, of course, what does stability imply? But let's assume for a moment that Taliban is able to establish complete control over the territory. They do form some kind of inclusive government, and that they are capable of preventing export of radicalism and terror beyond their borders. I think this would be something that would be welcomed across all powers. I'm not saying that this is the future, but I'm saying this is something that would be welcomed by all. But from a South Asian perspective, or rather from an Indian perspective, not a South Asian perspective. From an Indian perspective, this also, even this scenario causes certain problems because a stable Afghanistan under Taliban rule, oppressive not, I'm not getting into that, but the fact would be that it would distinctly increase China's role in the region. China's BRI would definitely then move ahead, and Central Asia, West Asia, and of course parts of South Asia would come under increasing influence of the Chinese. From an Indian perspective, given our current relationship with China, it is not necessarily the best scenario. But at the same time, as I said, it probably is better than the second scenario, where Afghanistan is unstable. I think Ambassador Lodhi has very eloquently described what happens to the region, not only us, but even, let's say, Central Asia and other areas. It is a danger, not just for Pakistan, it's a danger for everyone. And yes, Pakistan being on the front line will probably have to bear the brunt of it, of the instability or any kind of protracted fighting in Afghanistan. So eventually now, the overall Indian position, one is we have to recognize, I mean, I know there are many Indians who are stricken by angst that India is not invited to various discussions and all kinds of things. But the fact is, India does not deserve to be in any of these discussions. India simply does not have the kind of leverage that the other players have. It's as simple as that. If anyone wanted to today address a problem in Afghanistan, who would they speak to? Any other country, I mean, a third party country. They would try and reach out to maybe Pakistan, USA, China, or Russia. They're not going to reach out to India to resolve a problem that they have in Afghanistan. So I think India also has to temper its expectations. But yes, the fact is, while India may have limited on-ground leverage today in Kabul, the fact is India has considerable leverage with many of the players who are involved. And therefore, India has to use that influence, use those ties that it has, whether it's with the United States, whether it is with Russia, whether it is with Iran, to try and flag the concerns it has, and to ensure that the international community does hold whatever regime or whatever government comes to establish itself in Kabul, that it holds them to certain standards. And there I completely agree again with Ambassador Lodhi that international unity at this point of time, till, as she so eloquently described, the political fog lifts, till then, undoubtedly, international unity is the call for the day. And I just hope that the powers that are vying for influence, particularly the members of the extended Troika, that they don't allow their bilateral relationships to overcome the common cause that they have in the extended Troika and suddenly splinter up. And then you're going to have a real mess in Afghanistan. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Nandan. Let's now go to Huma Yusuf. I think you're muted, Huma.
Thank you, Michael. I hope you can hear me now. And thank you to the Wilson Center for convening this. I was going to add some additional comments from the Pakistani perspective, though, of course, Ambassador Lodhi is a very difficult act to follow. I will just try and sort of supplement some of the views she's already presented. So I think one of the interesting things from Pakistan's perspective, even these last few difficult days, which have been filled with sort of tragedy and anxiety and a sense of mourning from a certain constituency within Afghanistan about this turn of events, even in this difficult time, we've seen something interesting happen from Pakistan's perspective, which is that it has been able to play a role that it has historically played in the context of Afghanistan, which is to step up and immediately start to play some kind of key role in the humanitarian aspect in terms of providing support for the evacuation initiatives, already sort of starting to make provisions for refugees coming in to start that important conversation about how we are going to support people on a very human level who are affected or displaced by the developments in Afghanistan. And I think this is Pakistan at its best, frankly. And I think it's an important thing for Pakistan to find itself having to play this role and remembering that there is an opportunity for it to be a real partner to Afghanistan through this very difficult time in a way that slightly reorients the nature of the conversation over the past 2 decades. With that said, though, I do think that one of the things that we are likely to see, of course, everyone has touched a bit on the security developments and that being the key sort of concern for the region going forward. I think that in any scenario, even one where the Taliban are able to create some kind of inclusive, semi-stable Taliban-led regime in Kabul, there will inevitably be a gradual uptick in cross-border attacks, probably led by the Pakistani Taliban or some other groups that affect the western regions of Pakistan, so the ex-Fatah area, the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province in the northwest, and Balochistan. And this increase in militancy, cross-border militancy potentially, will always have this element of plausible deniability by all actors involved, resulting from the fact that the Taliban continues to be, even the Taliban that has taken over now, a fragmented, decentralized organization where Kabul-based Taliban leaders will not have complete and coherent and cohesive control over militant commanders operating in different districts across the country. And so, and similarly, there continue to be, we've heard this term over the last couple of years, the militant soup, where there is a lot of dynamism and fluidity in the way that different groups work together, the networks that they have, the resources and support they offer each other. And so I do think we'll continue to have this level of, even as the security situation gradually destabilizes and there is an uptick in sort of regional terrorism, that everyone will be pointing fingers at everyone else. And I think one of the interesting things to watch over the coming years will be what kind of relationship can an Afghanistan and a Pakistan have, and what will be the nature of that bilateral relationship going forward in this context of plausible deniability on all sides. I think that the world is quick to sort of conflate this idea of, oh, it's the Pakistan-backed Taliban and Pakistan has influence and Pakistan has leverage, but we are well beyond the 1990s, and that no longer is the case. And this is in some ways 2 states that do need to find a new equation of how to be bilateral partners. And I think that that's because of the security aspects to this, that's going to be a challenging and interesting conversation, and especially so in a scenario where things are in a worst case scenario, and there are sort of more transnational or global terror attacks that are linked back to Afghanistan. And as Ambassador Hale has alluded, pressure starts to come on Pakistan that it somehow take responsibility or step up and start to counter those issues. But I think that the world that we're in now will be a different one, where Pakistan's actual leverage and influence is one that we still need to see what that will take, shape that will take. So I think that will be an interesting development. I also think I'd like to spend a few minutes sort of on that geopolitical point that, again, several others have hit on. And I think that this will be, again, the question today is sort of what are the regional implications of Afghanistan? And I think seeing the success of something like the Troika Plus, seeing how China establishes its role in this, post 31st August position. It will obviously seek to reach some kind of agreement with the Taliban to secure its interests, primarily CPEC, but also to improve regional connectivity. Pakistan and Russia are talking frequently about how they have sort of similar goals. So it'll be interesting to see where the sort of broader geopolitical chips fall, in the sense of a country like Pakistan will have to make some difficult choices, I think, because while we're all calling for international unity, I think we're already starting to see some kind of bifurcation in tone, where there's a sort of Western message, which is around counterterrorism, and a sort of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Russia-China-led message, which is around regional connectivity and trade, and that there will be this implicit division between these 2 camps, and that Pakistan will find itself trying to speak to both, but struggling to sort of be heard in either. And I think that geopolitical dimension will be interesting. It'll also be interesting to see whether the way that the Middle East has been affected with certain, by these developments in Afghanistan, with sort of Doha having supported the talks, but Ghani fleeing to the UAE and some of the concerns arising within the Gulf that there may not be a completely unified approach there in terms of how they want to engage with Afghanistan, whether that would in turn then have further implications for South Asia. So I do think from the geopolitical perspective, there's going to be some interesting developments worth monitoring over the coming months and years. But I think I just wanted to end with some comments on sort of the social implications across the region and for Pakistan in particular of these developments. And I think we're hearing this idea repeatedly that religious groups, and I'm not talking about violent or extremist or militant groups, but just sort of religious groups, religious political parties, etc., will feel quite emboldened and encouraged by the Taliban's success. And I do think that we will see a resurgence in that kind of Islamist political forces. We'll start to see more sort of political parties making concessions to religious groups, sort of recognizing and being anxious about the fact that they seem to have won over, in some cases, the popular narrative, the sense that actually there is public support for something like a Taliban that can come in and offer less corruption, prompt justice, etc. And I think even the recent scenes coming out of Kabul of sort of urban, young, West-linked Afghans seeking to evacuate and relocate, it sort of really deepens a narrative that had already been emerging across the region, but also, of course, in Pakistan, of this sense that those who espouse sort of pro-democracy values, those who are progressive or liberal in their thoughts, those who are pushing for inclusive politics are somehow not indigenous, that they are Western agents or traitors, and that what is more indigenous or more authentic or local would be religious movements that somehow get tied up with Islamic identity. And I think the scenes playing out in Afghanistan give sort of a fillip to that kind of narrative and will make sort of progressive politics a bit more challenging, I think, across the region, certainly in Pakistan as well, because of the way that religious groups will be emboldened. But I think the biggest sort of disappointment, again, from across the border perspective and looking slightly long-term here, so not in the immediate few weeks and months, but I think one of the problems with this recent development is that the conversation is going to stay where it has been for the past 3 to 4 decades. We're going to be firmly in the space of terrorism, security, and geostrategic implications. And what that means when not talking about are the real challenges of the 21st century. So issues like climate change, water scarcity, the drought that is affecting Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the pandemic, health infrastructure. These topics are now going to get pushed back off the agenda while we all focus on the security implications of this development. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Huma. And indeed, that your final point was particularly important. The risk that these non-security challenges in Afghanistan will not be covered enough. I just saw recently that the World Food Program has indicated that there are more people, there are more children that are experiencing emergency levels of food insecurity in Afghanistan than any other country in the world other than the DRC. So this is heartbreaking. At any rate, let's now move, last but not least, to Dr. Venkat.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks to the Wilson Center, Ambassador Green, Abe, for inviting me to be part of this panel. I know Ambassador Hale started off and mentioned about the potential target, India being a potential target. But I think, more pertinently, I would say that security concerns, of course, are there with recent developments in Afghanistan. But more importantly, I think there are two counts on which Indian concerns, are currently revolving with recent developments in Afghanistan. One of them, of course, is the forceful manner in which this change has been perpetrated, and in such a short time. Unfortunately, it appears that the way forward is being decided by what's happening on the ground and not by what is being discussed in the conference rooms. It is an accepted fact that the US had to withdraw someday from its conscious decision to enter and maintain a presence in Afghanistan. And this had been deliberated upon for almost a decade. Yet some tough questions would be asked of the United States too, in terms of the manner in which this withdrawal has occurred and whether it could have been planned and executed more effectively, especially for retaining some form of democracy. Regardless of the actual reasons why this withdrawal has happened and the way it has happened, the recent developments in Afghanistan is a death blow to the fledgling democratic process that has been conceptualized for the last 20 years. Yes, there is an argument that the United States was in Afghanistan for 20 years. Yet I use the word fledgling very deliberately because democracies are not nurtured overnight. I think we'll all agree and acknowledge that as the world's largest and oldest democracies, we continue to evolve every day, despite so many years of experience. So 20 years of democracy in Afghanistan was unfortunately too short a time. The second count on which I think India's concerns resolve, or rather revolve, is the future of India's economic commitments towards Afghanistan. India has, over the last 2 decades, actively complemented the US military involvement in Afghanistan through its contributions in the economic reconstruction and rehabilitation process. There has not been any area that in Afghanistan that has not been touched, and projects have been taken up across 34 provinces of Afghanistan. So the future of these economic projects and the commitments that India has had with a democratic government in Afghanistan is another key concern that India has moving forward. How will things play out in the future? I think I would agree with my panelists that it is too early to currently analyze as developments are taking place even as we speak. But I am fairly certain that deliberations around certain key questions would reveal maybe how the future developments in Afghanistan and the larger region play out. Would the United States and its partners hold or retain any leverage over the Taliban so that it can resist or remain unresponsive to pressure from other terror groups? I know Ambassador Lodi, for example, mentioned a number of the terror groups. I can add a few more, like the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed and the Haqqani network, which worryingly there are signs, not just for India, but also for China, Russia, and the United States, that some of these elements are already a part of the Taliban's recent overrunning of Afghanistan. In this context, I think another key question that needs deliberation is whether it would be the right move to diplomatically isolate the Taliban government, because this doesn't provide an opportunity to engage with the Taliban to form an inclusive government. We are aware of resistance around the Panjshir region, and the repercussions of such resistance could quickly move into a civil war situation. And we could go back to the pre-2001 days. Further efforts to try and impose financial constraints could also be counterproductive, because what we would see is this could push the Taliban to seek other sources of incomes, including through poppy cultivation and drugs trafficking, and also make it more vulnerable to any sort of financial incentives, particularly from the terror groups that I have mentioned or Ambassador Lodi has mentioned. All these raise concerns for India on the security front. Yet, in comparison to the 1990s, I think on the security issues, today India is in much more effective control of security developments in its own, around its own borders, and also has a very robust national security management architecture in place. And what this has done is has resulted in a drastic reduction of terror attacks and a significant increase in elimination of terrorists. So while security concerns do exist with what has happened in Afghanistan, I think, unfortunately, it also tends to be overplayed, especially right now in the public narrative. The other question that I think requires a fair deal of deliberation is whether the US will accept a more proactive role for Russia and China in Afghanistan and the region moving forward. Russia has already started playing a more active role in neighboring Central Asia. President Putin has expressed concerns over the spillover of radical Islam into the region. Simultaneously, the presence of certain groups like the ETIM, which is sympathetic to the Uyghur cause in Xinjiang, also raises concern for China. And hence, China is also now becoming more actively involved. It has already begun diplomatic engagement with Taliban, and President Xi and President Putin have also agreed to cooperate in developments in Afghanistan, and more importantly, against foreign interference. Yet another question that needs deliberation moving forward is the US commitment to its allies. Again, was the nature and degree of involvement of regional partners in this decision-making process appropriately outlined and inclusive? The withdrawal of the United States, has that created a trust deficit among allies that will spill over into potential future cooperation in other important geographies? For example, the Indo-Pacific region, and especially in strengthening freedom of the open seas initiatives. Recently, coinciding with developments in Afghanistan, there was a public narrative that emerged about the US commitment to defend Taiwan if attacked by China. And this drew a response from President Biden. I want to conclude by just mentioning a couple more points. Contrary to the widely acknowledged narrative of gaining strategic advantage, I think state actors neighboring Afghanistan that have a symbiotic relationship with the Taliban, I believe will be in a very difficult situation moving forward. And they will have an important role to play amidst the recent developments in Afghanistan. Why do I say this? Because there is already existing concerns in the international community over certain state actors providing sanctuaries to terror groups that aim to destabilize regional security. Such concerns have already resulted in actions taken by the Financial Action Task Force, recommending very specific steps to be taken since the last 2-3 years. The threshold in the international community on acts of terrorism in comparison to the pre-2001 days is also very low. And hence, any attempt to use Afghanistan as a base to launch terror attacks, and there can be no control over these terror attacks. It could be on the Russian neighborhood, it could be in Xinjiang, or it could be against India, is only expected to further intensify international scrutiny of the Taliban and other state actors who support it. These very state actors have a difficult task ahead to ensure that the Taliban does not provide sanctuary to terror groups in Afghanistan. And now I think this is a point Ambassador Hale mentioned, that with the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan, one can expect the United States to exert more pressure on such state actors to crack down on terror elements, not only in Afghanistan, but within its own territory. So I'll stop there and maybe we'll move forward during the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Dr. Venkat, and thanks to the five of you. Terrific comments. You packed a lot of substance into a very small amount of time, so really appreciate it. We have just over 10 minutes left. I will forego my opportunity to pose a question because we have a lot of great questions from the audience, and I've tried to group a number of them together, and what we'll do here is have one round of questions that I'll direct to you, and then if there's more time, we'll go to more. So several questions for Ambassador Hale, focusing on the future U.S. role. So what approach do you think the U.S. should take toward the issue of recognition of the Taliban government? And also, what do you think are the prospects for U.S. intelligence capacities through the over-the-horizon notion when there's no boots on the ground? And more broadly, if you just wanted to briefly comment on what you think the U.S. role in broader South Asia should be post-withdrawal and with the Taliban in power in Afghanistan. And then I guess these could be directed to anyone, but perhaps I would suggest Ambassador Lodi and Huma Yusuf. Question of how much influence do you think the Pakistan will have over the Taliban now that the Taliban has taken power again and can essentially relocate and be completely present in Afghanistan? And finally, for Nandan and Dr. Venkat, there have been a number of questions about how India should deal with the developing situation, the developing geopolitical dynamics of the region, which many of you have already outlined, which appear to perhaps be disadvantageous for India. What should India's role be moving forward, looking at Afghanistan, given the reality of a Taliban government, as well as the likelihood that Pakistan and China, India's two rivals, could have opportunities, could have opportunities to develop a significant footprint in Afghanistan. So, Ambassador Hale, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Michael. Well, as to the future of U.S. relations with Afghanistan and the Taliban, I would say it's in the hands of the Taliban. They will be painting that picture. I think I laid out earlier some of the conditions that I personally, anyway, would expect. I think that at the top of the agenda has to be their posture toward terrorism and the projection of extremism from their country. If they take an attitude of adequate suppression of that, they've opened the door to some kind of relationship. Without that, there is no door that is open. I believe that those who talk about an inclusive government in Afghanistan are engaging a little bit in wishful thinking. Even if there are factions that are willing and ready to join the Taliban, I think they will quickly find that they will be muscled aside at any important key moments of decision about the guys with the guns. I wish it were otherwise, and I hope that more can be done in that regard, but I think we have to be realistic. And how the Taliban treats its people will be a key function as well of the nature of any opening of a relationship. That said, we do need to talk to them. That is not the same thing as diplomatic recognition. We will not achieve our goals without a dialogue, and I strongly favor that. I'm not an expert about our over-the-horizon capacity. I'm amazed by the things we can do, but there is no substitute for a physical presence. So there will be gaps, unfortunately, in that regard. And that's why, again, the role of our partners, the neighbors of Afghanistan, becomes so important, and the role of Pakistan in particular. As for the future of our policy towards South Asia, it's actually very encouraging. We have a rich array of interests and relationships in South Asia that have little to nothing to do with counterterrorism or with Afghanistan. And they sometimes have been overshadowed by this monumental investment that the United States was making in Afghanistan. We now are free of that burden, and I hope we can invest what we were spending on that effort in Afghanistan and in the neighboring states now on helping our friends and allies deal with the future. Counterterrorism will still be part of that, but opening the opportunities for the next generations in India, all throughout South Asia, and I want to continue to talk about Central Asia, will be key to building the stability needed not only for the benefit of those countries and our relationships, but to make sure that whatever is happening in Afghanistan, to the extent possible, is contained. Back to you, Mike.
Well, thanks a lot. Now the question about what we could expect for the future relationship between the Taliban and the Pakistani state. So Ambassador Lodi or Huma, if either of you wanted to briefly address that.
Yeah, I think, Michael, I'd like to make a few broad points as well, because I think this may be some confusion on this score, and I want to clarify that. One, there is no daylight between various members of the international community on what the expectation is of the Taliban. If you look at the Security Council statement, you look at the OIC communique, you look at the Human Rights Council statement of 2 days ago, they all say the same thing. So do not underestimate the power of collective opinion. This is extremely important. I also think it's unprecedented. Never have I seen, I've served at the UN for 5 years, never have I seen so much solidarity in terms of expectations. So I don't think it would be correct to say that the Russians and the Chinese want something else and the Americans, everybody wants top of the agenda, as David Hale says, top of the agenda for everyone. is combating terrorism. There is no question about that. So let's make no mistake on that score. Nobody is going to be lenient on that score. The second broad point I want to make is there is a mistaken assumption. I speak to the Chinese all the time. There's a mistaken assumption that the Chinese are just waiting on the border to rush into Afghanistan. Not true. They're very cautious. They're very careful. There is no way that they want to go and supplant another country just because, in fact, some in treaties that have been made to China that can you pick up the tab now of whatever in Afghanistan, they've often responded by saying, let's see how the situation turns out. Why should we pick up the tab, and clear the mess that has not been made by us? I mean, I'm paraphrasing them, so maybe it's not fair to sort of cite them. I'm not citing them, but that's my understanding of the Chinese position. So let's be very clear. I think one of the mistakes that Western countries make about China is that they assume that China is going to mimic their behavior. China does not mimic anybody's behavior. China's behavior is very much its own. So yes, there is a vacuum that has been left by the US and the coalition's withdrawal from Afghanistan. But now I think it's a bit rich to try to now say, why are the countries rushing in? I mean, you were there for 20 years and you left. So now it's up to the rest. I think the best bet still is for everyone to be on the same page and ensure that instead of sort of talking about this, vying for influence and so on, to ensure that it's a win-win solution or outcome for everyone. I think that's where Pakistan wants to be. And lastly, the actual question that you asked, which is such a narrow one, leverage. I mean, we don't know how much leverage we'll have, frankly, because we don't know how certain or uncertain the situation is going to be. So if I turn around and said, well, Afghanistan is a landlocked state, so Pakistan, geography gives Pakistan huge influence. Well, that's true up to a point. But there is a limit to how much we can do. Yes, we have been asked by the international community to play a certain role. We're trying to do that. And Huma was right in underlining the kind of stellar role that my country has played in the evacuation effort and in supporting the humanitarian response that's going on. Ask any UN agency right now, who's helping? Guess what? It's Pakistan. So I think we need to keep all of these in perspective. So to narrow down that Pakistan's only role is, let's just ask Pakistan about what leverage it has. Fine. By all means, ask that question. And as I said, the answer depends entirely on how the situation on the ground plays out. It's very hard. I still would argue that leverage is with the international community if it acts in unison. Otherwise, nobody has leverage. Thank you.
Thank you. Uma, did you want to add anything briefly?
No, I think this does get at the point that I was trying to make right at the outset, which is that I think a lot of this myth of Pakistan's leverage or so-called control, puppet mastery of the Taliban, this is outdated and inaccurate and is certainly not rooted in what's to come. And that a lot of that will have to do with the dispensation that does emerge in Afghanistan and the level of control that a Taliban-led regime based in Kabul would have over the rest of the country, and on the sort of numerous militant groups that are operating in that area, and the fact that we know that there will never be that kind of neat centralized control. And we also know that as activities happen and fingers are pointed here and there, that all groups will constantly try and refer to this idea of plausible deniability, that actually what I see emerging is a scenario where there is more potential for two sovereign states, Pakistan and Afghanistan, to find themselves at odds. And so this notion that, Pakistan will be the leverage, Pakistan will speak to the Taliban on behalf of the rest of the world, I just think that that's an outdated notion. And I agree with Ambassador Lodhi here that we need to look forward and see sort of what situation emerges there, how much influence the unified international community will have, and other sort of geopolitical developments in the region. And then based on that, we can see what role Pakistan could politically play in terms of engaging with the Taliban going forward and with whatever government emerges out of this period of uncertainty.
Thank you, Huma. I really appreciate the comments. So let's come to Nandan and Dr. Venkat. I think you will essentially have the last word. Any brief thoughts on India's role, what it can and should do in this very complex environment right now. Nandan, maybe you want to go first?
Absolutely. And Venkat can always jump in and add whatever he thinks necessary. Let me start with this thing that I agree with Ambassador Lodhi, that China acts in its own interest. I mean, completely. And any great power should. I also believe that China, I was racking my brain, but I could not find one instance where China has done anything for charity for anybody. So I agree, again, that it does everything in its own interest. I also have not found a situation where China has backed away from taking risks if it sees the cherry at the end of that risk. So in the given situation where the United States has left a vacuum, as you pointed out, I think the Chinese would be in the right frame of mind if they moved in and tried to check out whether they can get any benefits or not. I'm not worried about the Chinese, Russians, or anyone else trying to fill the vacuum. That is not the point. The point is, however, slightly different, that I am trying to make at least, is that what is the geopolitical situation that we are confronted with from an Indian perspective? From an Indian perspective, it's very simple. India has two essential challenges. One is purely internal. India has a development challenge. It has close to 400 million poor people. These people have to be lifted out of poverty, come what may. That is a challenge, and it has to be done. The second challenge is very simple again, that India does not want the emergence of a hegemon on the Eurasian landmass or the linked so-called Indo-Pacific. And India is going to align with whoever is willing to help and shares these values with India and move towards that goal. So the geopolitical situation is not significantly in that sense changed because of Afghanistan. Yes, in a regional sense, there has been a change. There is a worry. There are certain concerns. But as Venkat said, India is capable of dealing with the security aspects of it. We have built a robust system, and we are not worried about that. But what we are worried about is the growth of influence of various players in the region as a whole. And that is something India will have to learn to deal with. And as I said, that will be linked to India's internal policies, because as India develops its capacities, it will find greater and greater strength to resist these forces that it faces. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nandan, for that intervention. Venkat, let's go to you for your brief final comments.
Thank you. I think the question was about how India is going to deal with some of these developments. Just like China, I think India is also going to be very pragmatic with this approach and focus on its national interests. It would ideally like to deal with the Taliban. But as Ambassador Hale said, how do you deal with the Taliban that is, impacting women's rights and destroying infrastructure, cultural heritage in Afghanistan? So it will become increasingly difficult to justify any such engagements, although India would like to do that because, we have really invested economically in Afghanistan for the last 20 years, and we would like to continue doing that. The Taliban has acknowledged it. The Taliban has never, ever had any position when it comes to Kashmir. So I don't think there is a concern in terms of engaging with Taliban. The concern would be in terms of, and I agree with Ambassador Hale, that concerns would be in terms of how the Taliban decides to form the government, what is the representation in that government, how does it approach certain key important issues. I think that will decide India's approach, but all options are on the table.
Well, thank you very much, Venkat. Well, with that, as expected, the hour flew by. We went over a bit, but unfortunately, we need to wrap up. This was a great conversation. Just wanted to say that we will have soon, in the coming weeks, we'll have some activities, some events focused on the implications of the situation in Afghanistan for China and for Russia, which we got into a bit today. We'll get into that in detail in the coming weeks. And I'd also encourage all of you listening to consult our Afghanistan content page on the Wilson Center website, wilsoncenter.org/region/Afghanistan, which has all of our recent activities, publications, products, including those associated with the Afghanistan initiative, Hindsight up front. But with that, I will need to adjourn. So once again, I want to thank our 5 excellent panelists and thank all of you who tuned in. Thank you for the great questions. Sorry that I couldn't get to all of them, but this has been great. Thank you. And everyone, please stay well and stay safe. So thank you very much. We're adjourned.